1830. Yorkshire. Freedom on the brink of slavery. The cold, bone-aching morning of a Yorkshire market square. The frozen cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with frost. Every breath you take quickly dissipates into a small cloud of mist. But the murmur of this gathering crowd carries neither the joy of festivity nor the bustle of commerce. This is a different sound entirely. The low hum of desperate anticipation mixed with dread. Around your neck, you feel the rough scratch of a thick rope, a halter like those used for livestock. Your husband's calloused hand grips the other end, and his voice rings out in the freezing air, like he's praising a valuable beast brought to market. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" His eyes are slightly glazed from the ale he drank at dawn, but his tone is firm. Strong back, sound teeth, she can cook and she can mend. The crowd closes in. Their faces are a complex study in curiosity, revulsion, and cold calculation. Some men step forward, examining you like they would a horse. They check your hands. The calluses are proof of your work ethic. They look at your face, judging if you are comely enough to warm their bed. Your heart pounds a frantic drumbeat against your ribs. You know that the next few minutes will determine the entire course of your life. You might fall into the hands of a kinder master than the man who brought you here, or you might be consigned to an even worse servitude. But the greatest fear, the ultimate paradox, is this. This is legal. This is no back-alley crime or mad, desperate act. This is, within the twisted logic of the era, a woman's only path to freedom and divorce. Before we plunge into these stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the buried truths of history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Also, please let me know where you are listening from in the comments. I find it incredible that we are connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The tradition of wife-selling was not born from cruelty alone, though cruelty certainly played its part. This practice emerged from a rigid legal system that offered the poor no alternatives. To understand why hundreds of British men led their wives to market squares with halters around their necks, we must step into a world where women were seen not as people, but as possessions. In Victorian England, there was a legal statute called coverture. This meant that the moment a woman married, her legal identity was completely suspended. As the renowned legal scholar Sir William Blackstone wrote in 1753, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is consolidated and incorporated into that of her husband. The woman became what the law termed a femme covered, a covered woman, as if she were wearing an invisibility cloak, hidden beneath her husband's legal persona. Imagine Mary Thompson, a fictional but representative working-class woman of the 1820s. Before marriage, she could own property, sign contracts, and even sue someone in court. But the moment she spoke her vows, everything changed. Every penny she earned belonged to her husband. Any inheritance she received became his property. If she started a small business selling bread or taking in laundry, every farthing she made was legally his. Even her clothes, the very dress on her back, were legally his property. If Mary's husband William decided to beat her until she couldn't stand, the law offered little protection. A man had the right to correct his wife, just as he might discipline a child or train a dog. If William gambled away their rent money or spent their food budget on ale, Mary had no legal recourse. If she took in washing until her fingers bled while he refused to work, or if he brought home diseases from brothels, the law viewed this as his prerogative as head of the household. What happened when William's correction left Mary with broken ribs? Or when his drinking meant their children went to bed hungry every night? What happened when she met someone else? Perhaps a kind widower who treated her with dignity, or a bachelor who offered genuine affection. For the upper classes, divorce existed, but it was so ruinously expensive and complicated that it might as well have been reserved only for royalty. Before 1857, dissolving a marriage was a luxury reserved for the elite. To obtain a divorce, you needed a private Act of Parliament, a process that began with a staggering fee of at least £1,000. That amount is roughly £118,000 in today's money, a fortune most working-class families would never accumulate in a lifetime. Even when the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 later brought the process into the courts, making it technically more accessible, the cost was still around £40. This was more than a laboring man's entire annual wage. For the masses, the legal system simply wasn't an option. For the poor, there were essentially only 5 ways to terminate a marriage. Mutual separation. Both parties could agree to live apart, but this kept them legally bound and unable to remarry. Desertion. One spouse could simply vanish, hoping they wouldn't be tracked down. Church court separation. One could seek a legal separation from the ecclesiastical courts on grounds of severe cruelty or adultery, but this was costly and still forbade remarriage. Death. Given the harsh living conditions of the era, this was sadly a common conclusion to many marriages. Wife selling. The practice of wife selling emerged around the late 17th century. It was likely born from sheer desperation and bolstered by an ingrained folk belief. Since the law declared the woman to be the husband's property, the logic was brutally simple. If she is property, why can't she be legally transferred like any other chattel? The ritual that followed was a bizarre public spectacle, a humiliating yet strangely structured grotesque parody that combined the drama of a public divorce with the legal transfer of a contract. The process often began with an advertisement in the local newspaper. These notices read exactly like a livestock auction. John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market next Tuesday. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Sometimes the ads were more candid, reflecting the sheer exhaustion of the husband. Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. She can wash, cook, and milk cows. On the designated day, the husband would lead his wife to a public space. This was usually the market square where cows and sheep were sold, though sometimes a local tavern served the purpose. The symbolism was intentional and devastating. The wife wore a halter around her neck, wrist, or waist. It was typically a rough rope, occasionally a ribbon, a pathetic attempt to maintain dignity in the face of absolute degradation. This halter was not mere costume, it was the physical symbol of her transference as property. The husband, often acting as the auctioneer, would call for bids. What am I offered for this fine woman? She's 26, capable of bearing children, excellent at needlework, and has all her teeth. The crowd would surge forward, men inspecting the woman with the critical eye of a buyer at a horse fair. They'd check her hands for calluses and examine her appearance.
But here is where the historical records reveal a critical nuance that fundamentally changes our perspective on these scenes. In the vast majority of documented cases, the sale was pre-arranged. The buyer was frequently the woman's lover, and the auction was, in reality, a consensual divorce and remarriage ceremony rolled into one public act. The intense public humiliation served a practical purpose. It made the separation publicly witnessed and, in the eyes of the community and the participants, legally binding. Take the case documented in Brighton in 1826, an incident that partly inspired Thomas Hardy's famous novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man sold his tidy-looking woman for £5 to a sailor. The local newspaper reported that she seemed nothing loath to go, and that the transaction was conducted with every appearance of good humour. The sailor had almost certainly been courting her for months, and the public sale was the only way all 3 parties sought to legally end one life and begin another. At Vlock Market in 1830, a wife sold for a mere 2 shillings and 6pence, insisted that the transaction proceed despite her husband's last-minute hesitation. She reportedly slapped his face and declared, "Let be, you rogue! I will be sold. I want a change." Her fierce, determined voice echoes across the centuries, seizing the tiny amount of agency the law allowed her in this barbaric loophole. The prices paid were wildly erratic, from a high of £100 plus £25 per child, over £18,000 today, down to the cost of a mere glass of ale. Most sales, however, fell between 2 shillings 6pence and 5 shillings, roughly equivalent to £20 to £50 today. But the money was never the true point. What truly mattered in these market square transactions wasn't the paltry sum exchanged. What mattered was the public nature of the event, witnessed by dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who could later attest that the woman had been officially transferred from one man to another. The halter, the symbol of degradation, held profound power. Once the sale was complete, it was handed to the new husband as the tangible proof of the finished contract. This was more than mere theatre.
It was a desperate, collective attempt to manufacture legal validity where the official law offered none. The participants needed to believe, and critically, they needed to convince their community that their actions were legitimate. To further legitimize the act, the ritual sometimes became extraordinarily elaborate. Bills of sale were drafted and signed, deliberately mimicking the language used in real property transfers. I, John Parsons, for and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid, do sell, assign, and set over unto John Tuker, Anne, the wife of the said John Parsons, with all right, property, claim, services, and demands whatsoever during the term of the natural life of her, the said Anne Parsons. The ceremony often culminated with the entire party retiring to the nearest pub for a wedding feast, paid for by the new husband. In one case, documented in 1827, church bells were even rung. The community, starved for drama and public entertainment, treated these occasions as major social events, a strange hybrid of a court proceeding, a carnival, and a public shaming. However, not every wife sale was a prearranged consensual escape for desperate lovers. Some were genuine, brutal auctions where women were truly bid upon by strangers. In March 1766, a carpenter from Southwark sold his wife on a whim, driven by conjugal indifference at a local alehouse. When he sobered up and asked her to come back, she refused. In his despair, he hanged himself. The sheer, devastating desperation, driving both the sale and its tragic aftermath, speaks volumes about the impossible legal constraints of the time. In Manchester in 1824, a wife was initially knocked down for 5 shillings, but disliking the purchaser, she insisted on being put up again for a lower price, 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The woman's voice, her veto power, mattered. She could refuse buyers she found unsuitable. Yet, imagine the sheer terror of standing there, a piece of meat on the block, while strangers weighed your worth, knowing your entire future hinged on the whim of the highest bidder. The practice was particularly concentrated in Yorkshire, which accounts for 27 of the 108 documented sales from the Victorian era. In May 1837, a Halifax blacksmith first sold his wife for a shilling, then bought her back, only to sell her again to a married man for half a crown. The wife, upon learning of these serial transactions, responded by mauling her faithless spouse rather severely, a detail that strongly indicates her lack of consent in any of these arrangements. The most dramatic sales often drew immense crowds. In December 1849 in Goole, after a man named Ashton found his wife had eloped with her lover while he was in the hospital, he tracked them down and arranged a public auction. The Yorkshire crowd watched with fervour as the young woman was sold to her partner for 5 shillings and 9pence after spirited competition. As she left with her new man, she snapped her fingers at her ex-husband and declared, "There, good for naught. That's more than you would fetch." Even children were not exempt from this tragic trade. Wives were sometimes sold with their children included in the price, treated as accessories to the main purchase. In 1865, one woman and her 2 children were sold for £100 plus £25 for each child, a total sum representing several years of a working man's wages. The buyer was taking on not just a wife, but an entire family and the substantial financial burden that entailed. The reaction of the authorities to wife selling was erratic and frequently bewildered. Legally, the practice was entirely without basis. It was essentially a conspiracy to commit adultery, followed by bigamy when the new couples inevitably married. Yet many local officials were uncertain about their power to interfere. In 1819, a magistrate who tried to stop a sale in Ashburn, Derby, was pelted and driven away by the mob. He later admitted his confusion regarding the sale itself. "I do not think I have a right to prevent it because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, of which perhaps it would be dangerous to deprive them by any law for that purpose." Shockingly, some local officials even encouraged the practice. The grotesque custom of wife selling was sometimes mandated by the very institutions meant to protect the poor. Poor law commissioners, responsible for housing the destitute in workhouses, occasionally forced husbands to sell their wives rather than burden the parish with the cost of separated families. In 1814, Henry Cook was compelled by Effingham workhouse authorities to sell his wife instead of having the parish support her and their child. She was taken to Cudden Market, sold for £1, with the parish footing the bill for both the journey and a celebratory wedding dinner. The selection of the marketplace was not a coincidence. Markets were the sites where livestock changed hands, where property was officially transferred, and where the community gathered to authenticate transactions. By choosing these spots, participants injected their private drama into the most public, commercial space available. They were demanding validation from their community for an act the formal legal system refused to recognize. The symbolism was razor-sharp. The halter around the woman's neck explicitly stated what the law only implied, that a wife was property, no different from an animal. In some horrific instances, women were even priced by weight, just like livestock. This wasn't a metaphor, it was the chilling, logical extension of the legal doctrine of coverture.
The practice began its decline in the 1840s as social attitudes shifted and legal divorce became marginally more available. Newspaper coverage grew harshly critical, denouncing the sales as disgusting and disgraceful scenes. The emerging middle class, deeply embarrassed by these public displays of what they saw as working-class barbarism, began to push for official prosecutions. By the 1850s, participants, seeking to maintain the legal pretense while avoiding public shame, increasingly performed sales privately by deed rather than public auction. Social reform movements, including the Salvation Army and other evangelical groups, preached against the custom. Yet, the stubborn, practical constraints of poverty persisted. In a stunning irony, a Salvation Army member sold his own wife for £1 in Nottinghamshire in 1889. Even reformers couldn't always escape the impossible financial pressures that made wife-selling a viable solution. The last recorded wife sale in England occurred in 1913, where a woman giving evidence in a police court claimed she had been sold to a workmate of her husband's for £1. By then, the practice was a dying relic, sustained more by sheer desperation and tradition than by any true belief in its legitimacy. The deepest horror of wife-selling wasn't the grotesque ritual itself. It was what the ritual exposed about the society that made it necessary. These were not savage rites practiced by barbarians. They were the logical, albeit gruesome, response of rational people trapped in an irrational system. When the law provides no remedy for an intolerable situation, people will invent their own, no matter how degrading. The women who stood in those market squares with halters around their necks were not just victims of their husband's cruelty. They were fundamentally victims of a legal system that refused to recognize their humanity. They were caught between the legal fiction that they didn't exist at all and the harsh reality that they had to find ways to survive, to flee abuse, and to seek a chance at happiness. Some found that escape through the humiliating theatre of the public sale. They endured the ignominy of being auctioned because it offered the one thing the law denied them, a second chance. For a few shillings and the temporary price of their dignity, they could legally become someone else's property, and perhaps, if they were lucky, that someone else would treat them as a human being rather than a mere possession. The crowds who gathered weren't simply entertainment-seeking voyeurs, though spectacle certainly played its part. They were witnesses to a community's attempt to resolve problems the formal law would not or could not address. They were participating in a form of rough, communal justice, making public what private law kept devastatingly hidden. As historian Arthur Munby witnessed in a North Yorkshire village in February 1860, when an old man sold his much younger wife for a mere 18 pence, the buyer believed the act was proper and lawful. But the villagers often disagreed. The moral battleground was the marketplace itself, and the custom ultimately failed, not because the poor suddenly respected the law, but because the community's conscience could no longer bear the shame. The notion that the community universally approved of wife-selling is a myth. The practice remained intensely controversial and morally complex, even among the poor. In one North Yorkshire village, incident witnessed by Arthur Munby in 1860, after an old man sold his much younger wife for a mere 18 pence, the villagers burnt the pair in effigy on the green. Moreover, the custom crossed class lines far more than Victorian middle-class commentators cared to admit. The Duke of Chandos, for example, reportedly purchased his second wife from a stableman around 1740, paying half a crown for a woman the innkeeper was beating. The Duke had her educated, married her after her first husband died, and they reportedly lived happily. Her deathbed speech to her household, where she shared her history and spoke of her reliance on Providence, suggests that even an aristocratic wife sale could lead to genuine love and respect. These stories deeply complicate our understanding of what wife selling truly meant. Yes, it was degrading and humiliating. Yes, it treated women as literal property, but it was also, in its profoundly twisted way, a form of liberation. It offered a viable escape from marriages that would otherwise have guaranteed lifelong misery or a violent death. The historical record is clear. Many wives were active participants in arranging their own sales. In Plymouth in 1822, a woman provided the necessary money for her agent to buy her out of her marriage. In countless cases, wives insisted on the sale when their husbands developed cold feet. These women weren't passive victims being traded against their will. They were active agents, seizing the only form of divorce available to them.
This agency doesn't make the practice less horrific, but it explains its persistence for over 2 centuries. Wife selling wasn't merely about men disposing of unwanted wives. It was about families desperately trying to solve impossible problems with the only tools at their disposal. The broader context heightens the tragedy. This was an era where a working man might earn 10 shillings a week, where families lived in windowless single rooms, and where children as young as 6 endured 12-hour factory shifts. Life was short, brutal, and utterly lacking in choices. Marriage, which offered companionship to the wealthy, was for the poor often just another economic arrangement. When that arrangement collapsed, due to drink, violence, or infertility, the poor had nowhere to turn. The church offered moral guidance but no practical solutions. The law offered punishment but no relief. Only the crude justice of the community-sanctioned wife sale offered a practical exit. The middle-class journalists who penned the newspaper accounts of these sales, writing for middle-class readers, often viewed the events with utter condescension and moral outrage. They depicted the participants as brutish and the crowds as savage. But between the lines, we can read the true stories of desperate people making impossible choices with as much dignity as they could muster. When we view wife selling from our modern perspective, it's effortless to focus on the degradation. The image of a woman with a rope around her neck, auctioned like livestock, stands as a brutal symbol of female oppression. And it was. But it was also something more profound. It was a community's effort to create justice where the formal law offered none. It was the way desperate people claimed a small piece of agency in a system designed to deny them any choice. It was rough, deeply imperfect, and often cruel, but it was the only form of divorce available to the poor. The practice eventually died out, not because society suddenly became enlightened about women's rights, but because legal divorce became marginally more accessible, and because changing economic conditions slowly gave women other options. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to chip away at coverture, finally allowing wives to keep their earnings and inherit property. Slowly, incrementally, the law began to recognize that women were people rather than mere property. But for the women who stood in those market squares in the early 19th century, with halters around their necks and crowds pressing close to examine them, those changes came tragically too late. These women inhabited a world that denied them any legal identity, any right to their own earnings, and any escape from miserable or violent marriages, save for the humiliating spectacle of a public sale. Their stories are a stark reminder that progress is never guaranteed, and that the legal rights we take for granted were hard-won at enormous cost. They remind us that when official systems fail to deliver justice, people will inevitably create their own forms of justice, no matter how flawed or morally troubling. As you enjoy your comfortable modern life, with your legal right to divorce, your ability to own property, and your recognition as a full person under the law, remember the women who bought their freedom for a few shillings and the price of their dignity in the market squares of Victorian England. Remember that the protections you enjoy were built on the suffering of women who had no choice but to wear halters around their necks and hope that anyone a stranger, or a lover would treat them more kindly than the law did. The echoes of those market square auctions died out over a century ago, but they leave us with profound and uncomfortable questions. The horror of wife selling becomes even more visceral when we examine the specific mechanics of the auction itself.
Picture yourself back in that market square, but this time as an observer. The morning mist still hangs low, and the air carries the familiar stench of the livestock market, hay, manure, and the metallic tang of fear. But today, the terror comes from a different source. The person on the makeshift platform is not a cow or a sheep. She is someone's daughter, someone's sister. Let's call her Sarah, 28 years old, her hands roughened by toil, her face etched with the lines of poverty. The halter around her neck is not decorative, it's thick, chafing rope. Her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, holds the end with a practiced yet slightly trembling grip. "Come now, gentlemen," he shouts. "What will you give for this fine piece of woman flesh?" She's strong as an ox, can work 16 hours without complaint, and she's got all her teeth. He brutally forces her mouth open with a calloused finger, displaying her teeth to the crowd like a horse trader. The men press closer, their breath visible in the cold air, their eyes calculating. They are not caricatures of evil, they are laborers and tradesmen assessing value and practicality. They examine her hands, her hips, her face. A blacksmith pinches her arm to test the flesh. "A bit thin," he observes clinically. "What's her temperament like? Is she given to melancholy?"
"Sweet as a lamb when treated right," her husband quickly replies. But in Sarah's eyes, a hard, calculating intelligence contradicts his words. Her hands are clenched. She is not a passive victim. She is an active participant, playing a role that is her only viable path to freedom. The bidding is tentative at first. 2 shillings, calls a cattle dealer. Then 2 and 6, counters a young farmer, his face flushed with awkwardness. Sarah's eyes dart to him, sizing him up. Is he cruel? Will he beat her? Then a familiar voice rings out. 3 shillings. It is Thomas Miller, a widower she knows. Relief washes over her face. The arrangement is proceeding. But the young farmer doesn't know the choreography. 4 shillings, and I'll throw in a pig. The farmer is genuinely competing, and terror crosses Sarah's face. She could end up with a stranger. Thomas Miller counters desperately. 8 shillings. Sarah's ex-husband is now just greedy, and the crowd grows tense. Wife selling relies on community acceptance, and the crowds can turn when they sense something is wrong. Then, the unexpected happens. The woman speaks. "I choose Thomas Miller," Sarah says clearly, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. "I'll go with him willingly, but I won't be sold to no stranger like a sack of grain."
The crowd erupts. This isn't how the auction is supposed to work. But a dignity in her voice commands respect.
"The lass has spoken. Let her go to who she wants," shouts an old man. The husband, sensing the shift, quickly accepts Miller's bid, claiming the woman goes willing, so there's no arguing with the bargain. Thomas Miller steps forward with borrowed money. He formally receives the halter, then immediately removes it from Sarah's neck, tossing it aside with obvious distaste. The crowd applauds, having witnessed a satisfactory dramatic conclusion. Sarah, or Mary Ann Price, or any of the women whose stories fill the records, had simply traded one form of legal slavery for another, hoping the new master would be kinder. The true cost was not the few shillings, but the loss of human autonomy. Wife selling persisted not because the poor were barbarous, but because they were rational people, responding to an irrational legal system. The custom died out not through a sudden burst of enlightenment, but because legal divorce became slightly more accessible, and acts like the Married Women's Property Acts began, piece by piece, to recognize women as human beings rather than property. The market squares are empty now, but the questions they raised remain urgent. How do we ensure that our legal systems serve human needs rather than abstract principles? And how do we build a society where nobody is forced to choose between dignity and survival? In remembering the women who wore those halters, we honor not just their suffering, but their courageous, desperate survival. A grim reminder that freedom isn't free, and the price of justice is eternal vigilance.
They were silenced by law, by poverty, and by time itself.
Yet their voices still echo through the centuries. Women who dared to seek freedom in a world that denied them everything. Their pain is not just history. It's a mirror of how fragile justice can be when power forgets humanity. If these forgotten stories moved you, if you believe the past still has lessons to teach the present, then don't let their voices fade again. Every subscription, every like, every share helps keep history alive and ensures their suffering was not in vain. Subscribe to Dark Pages of History and join us in giving light to the stories the world tried to bury. Because the past isn't dead, it's only waiting for someone to remember.